Coming to you from beautiful Vancouver, Canada, this is Scuderia F1, the podcast that is always up to speed with the latest Formula One news. Follow us on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod and subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and Stitcher. Now, here's your host, Mark Daly.
Oh, I'm out! Crash! Somebody hit me in the rear, turn 2, and then somebody hit me in the rear again in turn 3. For sake. Honestly, what the are we doing here?
Hello and welcome to Scuderia F1, the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One. My name is Mark Daly. I'm your host, and I'm joined tonight, as always, by Kevin Laramie. Kevin, how are you doing tonight?
I am doing great, a lot better than Sebastian Vettel, that's for sure, especially after turn 2 and 3. But what another great F1 race. Yes, Nico Rosberg, like you, Freudian slip there, is winning again all the time. But at least from position 2 down to 22, it's very interesting.
Definitely, and there may not have been as much action as there was in each and every corner in China, but there were still so many things going on. And as you guys noticed off of the top, I played Seb's very colorful reaction to being knocked out of the race by Danny Kvyat in turn 2. And that was just one of the first things. There were still plenty of other interesting moments throughout the race. And not only did Nico Rosberg get the hat trick of pole position, fastest lap in the race victory, but he also had to nurse his car home. He came home in what they called safe mode because he had a mechanical issue, as did Lewis Hamilton, who finished the race with absolutely no water pressure. And Mercedes were saying that it was somewhat of a miracle that he actually did so, because he actually drove the last 16 laps, I believe, with zero water pressure. But that was amazing in itself. But the big story, of course, was Sebastian Vettel and Danny Kvyat again having a bit of an incident.
Round 2.
It wasn't a bit of an incident. It was actually a big incident. And yeah, it was round 2. I think you could make the argument that a couple of weeks ago in China that Sebastian Vettel left the door open and then allowed Danny Kvyat to come in on the inside and take the position. And then he drove into his teammate Kimi Räikkönen and kind of spoiled Ferrari's afternoon to a certain degree. But this time, Kvyat hit him not only once, but twice. And the second time put him out of the race and into the barrier. And Sebastian Vettel was very unhappy about it and actually went up to Red Bull Racing's Christian Horner and voiced his displeasure during the race, which is something I don't think we see all that often, is it?
No, we used to see this a lot more, especially of Michael Schumacher used to do that a lot.
Yes, he did.
Because he had that sort of gravitas, or Mika Hakkinen, or David Coulthard, that type of F1 driver that's been there for a while, that had that charisma, that presence, and that aura around them that they can actually approach a former boss like a Christian Horner for Vettel and say, look, hey, Christian, why don't you tell your boy to calm down a little? Why don't you tell your boy to watch where he's going? This isn't karting. This is, what are we doing here? Like, in his own words.
Well, that's true. And it's interesting because not only did Christian Horner apologize to Sebastian Vettel, but there's been some talk that perhaps that Danny Kvyat may be demoted to Toro Rosso with Max Verstappen getting promoted to Red Bull Racing as early as Spain. I don't think we've ever seen anything like that in modern F1. Do you recall anything like that, Kevin?
No, I don't. And, it's a bit of a shame because he is fast. Like, Danny Kvyat is fast. He is maybe, I don't want to say reckless, but he does take unnecessary risk, yes. But Danny Kvyat has proven this year that he's quite fast. And yes, it's the pressure of the two Toro Rosso driver actually performing very well with that car. Carlos Sainz and Max Verstappen are doing great laps, are proving their maturity, they're growing as drivers, and they're pushing the drivers of Red Bulls to mistakes or to overpressure. Look, if there's an opportunity, we can step up. we have what it takes, and we've been showing for years down here. So there's that pressure. So I don't know. It's something we haven't seen a lot of time, that a driver might be, we're saying might be because it's not necessarily official, and it's something that it's evolutive, it might change. But if a driver like Danny Kvyat is demoted and a fast young driver like a Verstappen and Carlos Sainz comes up, it might be a way to say, look, all right, we need to calm down, and we need drivers to take care of themselves. They need to respect themselves a little more, because with those type of cars, especially with the reliability issues of a couple of them, if you just touch each other, both of our races are done. So we need to work together in a way. So there's that aspect. And just to add to that fact, Danny Kvyat got 3 points off of his license with that penalty that he got in the race as well.
Well, it just looked really bad. And I know that there was some talk coming out of the Red Bull garage saying that, okay, well, you can hit somebody in one corner at the start, that's forgivable. But to hit the same guy again the next corner down the track, that is basically unforgivable, and that's like not what we're all about.
It was like 400 meters further too.
Yeah,
like right there. You just hit me what did you just pay attention?
And it's too bad because Ferrari again had a very good qualifying session. Sebastian Vettel actually finished second, but then had that 5 position grid penalty for the gearbox change. Raikkonen qualified in fourth, well, third after it was all changed. And then the 2 Williams were right up there to start the race as well. And that actually, I think, worked out very well for Nico Rosberg, because after that mayhem in the first couple of corners there between Kvyat and Ferrari, and cars going all over the place trying to avoid the accident and then the subsequent safety car, that those 2 Williams did slow down some of the other cars, especially Raikkonen and his teammate Lewis Hamilton in the laps thereafter, and maybe just slowed them down long enough, because once Nico had that clear track in front of him, again, he was literally off to the races. He didn't look back. He made his first pit stop, came out well ahead, and even though he had the problem at the end of the race, there wasn't really any doubt, unless he had a major mechanical failure or some sort of mental lapse where he put it off the track and into the wall himself, that there was going to be no way that he was going to win that race.
No, absolutely. And I want to make a point as well to put in perspective, Mark, because we talk about the dominance of Nico Rosberg. Let's look pragmatically at what that dominance is. At the biggest peak in that race, his advance was about 15, 16, 17 seconds in front. And that, to be honest, when you compare it to the minutes and a half and lapped all the rest of the field that we've seen with Schumacher and Ferrari over the years, and with Mercedes, with the Mika Hakkinen years, 15, 17 seconds of a dominance is big. It's a big gap, but it's manageable. It's beatable. It's clawable throughout the season. You make marginal gains here and there. You climb a second here, get a second there. And midway down a 21 race season, there's a way that gap can be bridged. And I think it's important to mention that the dominance of Rosberg and Mercedes has been talked about a lot, but realistically, it's not that much. In history, we have seen a lot worse, and we have to mention it because people are like, oh, it's boring, it's a procession of Rosberg. No, it's only about 16 seconds. And in a world of Formula One where it's not necessarily reliable, it's still, anything can happen.
And definitely, and I think the gap was about 13 or 14 seconds at one point, and then Nico hit a stretch of traffic there. And at one point, Hamilton managed to close the gap down to about 7 to 8 seconds thereabouts. And then even when he was going through the traffic, once Nico was clear of it, had a bit of a clear track in front of him and maybe the occasional back marker he needed to lap, that gap was still coming down. And then it was only really that when Hamilton had that water pressure problem at the end of the race, did that gap steadily increase. And then, of course, we found out afterwards the reason for that, and that basically Lewis was just trying to bring the car home in one piece and try and secure the points. And because, right now, Nico Rosberg is on 100 points in the Drivers' Championship. He's 43 points ahead of Lewis Hamilton, who's in second place, which is kind of amazing when you think about it, considering all the other disasters that have befallen Ferrari and the misfortunes that they've created themselves or have been thrust upon them. Thank you, Danny Kvyat. That Lewis is actually quite fortunate to be in second place with 57 points. Obviously, that 43-point gap up to Nico Rosberg is a long way to go. There's still 17 races to go, but I think that Lewis might quietly think that, okay, well, it hasn't started very good for me so far in 2016. The first 4 races haven't gone the way that I would want them to do, the way that I expect them to. I mean, he had that problem again in qualifying where he had a problem with the power unit. He wasn't able even to go out in Q3 and didn't even set a time and then started in P10. So he must be happy, or at least, or maybe not happy, but at least recognizes that things could be a lot worse.
Exactly. And the fact that you mentioned that they both finished the race in quote unquote safe mode, trying to conserve the car, because car has to work again. It's not a different one every race. It's the same one that goes through ebb and flows, except if it's destroyed. One thing that was interesting to me too, it's Nico Rosberg, well, about maybe 10 left to go. He needed to do a very fast lap just to stay focused, to see what he can do, to stay sharp, in his own words. And he just opened up the valves and beat the lap record and just closed it and went back to just running around. And I think it was impressive. And it's not the first time I hear this, that a F1 driver needs to challenge himself or always need to push in a way. Otherwise, he might step into a routine and make mistakes. And when you make mistakes at 300 kilometers an hour, it is very dangerous. So I think it was very important for Nico Rosberg to make time and to make effort to actually maybe make a couple of fast laps, even at the end, to make sure that he was focused.
Definitely. And we haven't really seen Nico have to fight anybody. Of course, he didn't really have that.
He fought himself in the clock. That's all he did.
Well, that's true. And apart from that poor start that he had at the Australian Grand Prix when Vettel caught them both by surprise, both the Mercedes, I mean, and took the lead into the first corner of that race. Basically, since then, since Nico got in front, it seems like he's been in front ever since. And I mean, he's won 7 Grand Prix in a row now. And there's really, at this point, it's like, well, do you want to try and argue against that? Nico Rosberg is not going to win 2 weeks from now in Spain, or a month from now in Monaco, or a month and a half now in Canada. I mean, he's just riding this phenomenal wave of good fortune and this good form that, I mean, he's just, everything's coming up Nico at the moment.
It is. And it's almost like not a given, but we expect him to be number one in every qualifying. We expect him to win every races because he does have a total package for now, which means the best car for now, which has been reliable, but when we're looking at his teammates, the same parts together can be unreliable. So there's always that asterisk in the back of the head of Nico Rosberg. So look, it might be good that I'm racking up points right now because you never know. In the next few races, I might be the one with problems that actually affects the results of my races, not Hamilton. So I might be the one not getting full points on my finishes. And then a driver like Hamilton will be able to climb back in the fight of the championship. So there's always that aspect that's in the back of the head of Nico Rosberg. Look, I've got to put points in the bank because my car is not theoretically reliable like some of the other cars. If you're looking at a Williams, which has been described as one of the most efficient car ever built because of the amount of money into it. They don't have the same budget as a Ferrari, as a Mercedes, but they're getting the most out of every single component, and that car is the most efficient aerodynamically, mechanically, engineering speaking, with the driver all together. It's like I don't want to say utopian dream, but it's like the whole squad is really pulling in the same direction in one of the car, and the car is a result. It's a piece of engineering that, look, the gap that they have, they're probably the third best team in the sport right now. And it's not about money, it's about everything else. And I think that efficiency and that nice story for Williams, it's just a dedication of, look, when you have the experience and the rules change and there's ways to retake what you once had, well, we've seen Williams do that this year too, and that's impressive on as well.
Definitely. And again, they got P4 and P5 in Russia, so they got points there from both drivers. And it's interesting, just as you were talking there, I was thinking that perhaps we haven't seen what they've been or what they're capable of so far this year, because we've seen in a couple of races in the opening 2 months of the year that their strategy at times wasn't perhaps the best that it could have been, and it just the car wasn't able to perform. They went for longer stints on harder tires, and they just didn't have the pace. I mean, we saw how they were just basically mobile roadblocks at times in China and Bahrain and stuff like that. But I think that they did very well. And for Bottas and Massa to get P4 and P5 this past weekend, I think that's pretty good for them. And of course, they're fourth in the constructors standings at the moment, behind Red Bull Racing and just ahead of Haas. But I mean, they're not that far behind Red Bull, and they're quite a ways up the road from Haas, who managed to get back in the points again this weekend at Sochi with Romain Grosjean. Didn't have maybe some of the more spectacular drives that we've seen from the first couple of races. Obviously, I think a couple of weeks ago in China was a bit of a race to forget for Haas and Romain Grosjean, but he drove a pretty solid race again this past weekend, and to get some points again for Haas, I think is very good.
Well, after the basically euphoria of the first couple of races for Haas, where they got a point where they weren't supposed to. So now, you know what they have to do? They basically already have their season-long goal of making points, at least one, to have some of the expenses being reimbursed by FOA and all that. So by having those points, now they can maybe focus, I don't want to say on next year, because it's not the way that I want to explain myself, but focus on the evolution of the project. Focus on not the next race. Yeah, it's important, but the gap that you have with the performance of your car to the other ones and the gap of everything else, you're still building that project. So take the experience you had in the first couple of races, mix with your American motorsport experience over the last decades of existence, mix everything, all that together, and by the end of this year, you'll be able to have a team that for the years to come is built on solid basis. And I think that's what's important for this team. And it's almost a blessing in disguise for a team like Haas to have a 21 race first season in this world of Formula One, because, well, a pyramid, it's solid because the base is solid. It's wide and it's very strong. Their first year of season, they'll get data on all those tracks. They'll get a lot of experience with some experienced drivers and a younger one. You can mix all of them together, but the amount of data of experience they will amass this year will be priceless heading into 2017-18, regardless of the change of the rule. So that's going to be probably a blessing in disguise for Haas, and it's going to be a struggle. And we have seen it. And once they can have a couple races with no points and we barely see them on our TV screen, and then if everything is right, if all the circumstances are aligned together, they can squeeze in and gather a couple of points like they did this weekend.
Yeah, and it's really interesting and really cool to see, because I think that after they scored points again in Bahrain, that Gene Haas said, well, you know, we're not here just to make up the numbers. We're here to compete with teams, and we can we're hoping to win points, or we've proven that we can score points each and every race. I kind of thought to myself, well, you know, we're only 2 races into the year, so maybe that will happen, maybe it won't. And then, of course, in China, they didn't have a very good race, and it was one to forget, as I said. And I thought, well, okay, here we go. Here's the regression to the mean. Maybe it was just a couple of lucky races, but here we go again this past weekend. Grosjean with a P8, you know, pretty impressive on a track that, well, I mean, the other teams have some data on there because they've been there for the last 2 years. But so we'll see here. We'll bring this one back up in round 10, whatever the 10th race of the year is. There's so many races, it's kind of hard to keep track of which one is which, and see then, well, how have they done in the next half dozen races after Sochi, and how they've done from there. But a very good start from them this year. But also, what was also good to see was a double points finish for McLaren, Jenson Button in P10 and Fernando Alonso in P6. That was something that we hadn't seen since Hungary last year, and you can maybe argue that was I think maybe a bit of a lucky finish for them last year. But this past weekend, I think that they were full value for money for P6 and P10.
No, they are absolutely. But what's weird with me with McLaren is when you look at the car, I don't know if it's the paint scheme, if it's the way it looks, if it's the almost the blank driver's suit that Button and Alonso wear. I don't know. This team is like missing something. I don't know. It's like it's McLaren, but it doesn't feel like McLaren. I don't know if it's because of the color scheme once again, or I don't know the performances. But this team this season, I don't know. There's something weird about it.
Yeah, I think nondescript might be a bit of a word to describe it, because when you go
feels
back,
like a plain team. It's plain.
Yeah. And they've got two very good drivers. Obviously, both of them are former world champions. McLaren have constructors' titles that you can't count on one hand. I mean, it's a very accomplished team. I mean, when you go back, just talking about the paint scheme, you go back to the 80s and the 90s when they had the white with the Dayglow orange on the Marlboro.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And then afterwards, when they had formed that partnership with the Mercedes engines in the later 90s, they had the silver and the black and the West cigarettes. Yeah. And now it's just that they've sort of taken all the silver off and gone completely black, which, I guess it could kind of work, but you still kind of look at it and it just doesn't look like a McLaren. Maybe if they can get back up to the front of the pack and start challenging some of the big dogs like your Ferraris, your Mercedes, Williams, Red Bulls, teams like that, maybe we'll shed these thoughts and these opinions, but there just seems to be something lacking or missing with McLaren, and it is odd. It is odd, but it was good to see that they were back up there, and they're going to have some upgrades coming for Spain. And you have to think, though, the experience and the knowledge, and not only just with McLaren and with Honda, it's just at some point logic just screams to me that they're going to have to get it right. They can't be like this forever. I mean, they're slowly starting to perform a little bit better, starting to get some results, but I think it's probably taking a lot longer than most people expected.
And it's unrelated, but maybe if they would bring back the white and red, it would bring back the real results that they would have had in the last. Actually, to be fair, they didn't get really good results when they were wearing the black and red, so the white and red. So maybe that's why. But history in Formula One is something that's really talked about with the biggest champions like Schumacher and Fangio. But we should see that history on the track. And when you have a car that always looks different, it doesn't have that same vibe, that same feel. There's basically only Ferrari that's been the same over the years. There's a couple of one like Renault, but not the Renault of today, but the old one like Benetton used to always keep the same type of feel to the car. But I think it's something that we don't necessarily pay attention to enough. Look, it's the identity of a team. It's the look, the whatever, the paint scheme, the color. It's what fans identify to, and I think it's really important. And when you have a nondescript team like McLaren, as good as they can be on the track, they're not going to catch anybody's attention with that type of car.
It kind of flies under the radar a little bit.
Literally,
from time
it looks
to
like
time.
it's stealth. It looked like it literally flies under the radar.
But you brought it up there. You mentioned Fangio and Schumacher, and Nico Rosberg winning his 7th Grand Prix in a row this past weekend puts him into some pretty elite company. There's only a handful of other drivers that have managed to win 7 races in a row. One was Michael Schumacher, one was Sebastian Vettel, and the other one was Alberto Ascari. So obviously he's in a very, very good company of drivers there. But at the end of the day, if he can't go on to put this season together and become world champion, that might be one of those things that at the end of his career he'll look back on as like, yeah, well, that was kind of cool, but I still never got that driver's title. So a very cool one. And also Ferrari, what with Raikkonen getting on the podium in P3 this past weekend, means that
the 1,000 podium, the 500th.
Sort of halfway in between. 700th podium for Ferrari. Amazing. 700 times on one of those steps at a Grand Prix. That is mind-boggling. Of course, they're one of the teams that have been there right from the very beginning. So I guess you can it's logical that they would have results, but I mean 700, that is very, very impressive. That's multiple podiums in multiple races just from time immemorial.
Well, there's basically between 16, 17, 18 races per season in F1 history. So for them to get to the 700 numbers, it's a lot of wins and a lot of podiums in a lot of races, because it's almost there's not necessarily a year without a podium for Ferrari when you look at the average for the whole history of this team, and that's what's impressive. It's the longevity, the evolution from the early days to the 6 wheels F1 to up to today. Ferrari, I've seen it all.
Well, and not only that, how many iconic drivers that are household names in Formula One that have driven the Scarlet Ferraris. The names are like I say, they're legends, they're icons. Michael Schumacher, Gilles Villeneuve. I mean, you can just keep going on and on and on. We could sit here probably for the next 10 minutes naming them all. And then there's
it's almost a rite of passage for an F1 driver to go drive for Ferrari at one point in their career. And it's almost like a bucket list type of thing for a driver that, look, you haven't arrived on the F1 stage truly yet until you have driven a Scuderia team.
That's very true, isn't it? And talking about Ferrari, apparently Sauber is going to get the latest spec Ferrari engine in Barcelona next weekend, but Toro Rosso won't. They also get the Ferrari power units as well as Haas, but the deal with Toro Rosso is that their engine deal with Ferrari means that they only get the 2015 engine spec. So I don't think that there's going to be much of a question that Toro Rosso will be better than Sauber. Sauber obviously have financial problems. They're struggling a little bit. They're not going to the test at Barcelona because they don't have a reserve driver, and they're not going to really be doing any evolution with their car. So they will have this latest spec Ferrari engine, but I think just all around the Toro Rosso is going to be the better car. I think it's just a better chassis, even with the year-old power unit in it.
Well, it's one thing for Sauber to have an updated and upgraded power block and engine from Ferrari, but it's one another thing to have the resources necessary to get everything out of that engine that could actually help you, and the reliability of all of that on the track. So those two are met with Toro Rosso, where they do have the funds and the resources to get all they can out of a drivetrain, out of an engine. But even if it's a 2015 one, if it's more up to spec and it's more efficient, it's still probably faster. So no, I have to agree with you there.
Yeah. And then also Lewis Hamilton said, just talking on the issue of reliability, is that he believes that at some point he's going to have an engine penalty at this season, considering he's had to switch pieces. And I believe that they actually went back and put in the engine that he used in Australia for this past weekend. So at some point he's going to have to deal with that. And he also thinks that he's going to have some sort of grid penalty for the being reprimanded for coming back onto the track in Sochi at the wrong points, where he ran a little bit wide and during the qualifying, and they had some especially demarcated area to re-enter the track, and he didn't do that. So will he be subject to some sort of sanctions for the next Grand Prix in Spain? Probably. Knowing Lewis's luck, unfortunately, he might have to deal with something like that, or who knows, maybe they'll let it slip by that. But there were a couple of guys, I think Sainz, I think may have run afoul of the stewards for doing the same things. Maybe it wasn't, but it could have been. I know that he wasn't, or Lewis wasn't the only guy that had problems there.
Tactically speaking, too, it's interesting, because if you know you're going to have to maybe change your engine, you can almost decide when to do it now. Because you know eventually you're going to have to bite the bullet once again and take that penalty or take that grid penalty. So do you actually choose when you do it? Do you choose before what race? Do you choose before a race that you need a motor that maybe is brand new to get a motor that has no crack and no history or no issues with it? So do you choose to do it before a race like Spain, or do you wait a few weeks before Monaco and the Montreal stretch, or what do you do? And that's interesting too, because if you know you're going to take those penalties, you can act accordingly and plan them over the course of the season. That, look, okay, we're going to plan it to take it here. We can anticipate that, look, this race doesn't necessarily favor our car, so we're not going to necessarily be the top car here, even though we have the best car as Mercedes. But technically speaking here, theoretically, if we choose to change our engine and to bite the dust and have that penalty here, well, we have a shot of still making it into the points, but the week after we will have a more powerful and reliable car. So that's interesting. When do you change it? Because if you change your motor, you know that in Montreal, your engine needs to be good, and it's coming in a month and a half. So that's where the thinking is too, is look, a month actually from now. So that's where you have to think about, do we change your engine now, or do we wait maybe after Montreal? Because Montreal might be really stressful for the engine. So those are all good questions that Hamilton and the engineers are probably asking themselves behind closed doors.
Yeah, I'm just, as you were talking, I was just looking up here. So engine penalties kick in when the sixth component of one of the six items, so the internal combustion engine, the turbocharger, the MGUH, the MGUK, control electronics, and energy stores used. So once you hit 6 on one of those parts or one of those components, then that's when you have the penalties. So Hamilton is already on his third turbocharger, and he's already used an MGUH, and he's still got 17 races to go. So So I think he's being quite pragmatic and maybe realistic at some point in such a very long season that he's going to be forced to deal with it.
Sorry to interrupt, Mark, but there's a way to, if you change a part for the exact same part that doesn't have an evolution, I don't think it actually counts in the same parts. But that's very interesting too, because if you just change the part for the, a broken part or an inefficient part, there's different ways to calculate to make sure that some of them do fit and some of them don't in that 6-part penalty rule.
Yeah, well, you can't just change out the whole engine. Obviously, Alonso had to use up one of his allotted engines for the year because he destroyed his car in that huge crash in Australia. But it's just when you can replace parts here and there, these different components of the engine. So you do have a little bit of leeway where, you are able to change it and not have to worry about a penalty. But perhaps maybe that is what Hamilton is worried about. He's going through some of these components a lot quicker. Who would have expected that Mercedes would have had problems with a water pump, and then Rosberg had an issue with his. So by their own lofty standards, they can't be too happy with that. The reliability maybe not being quite what it was, and maybe being overshadowed by the fact that they did come home with another 1-2 finish. But it is interesting, and I think that it is a bit of a better evolution on the rules to have that flexibility that, okay, my turbochargers aren't working, so I have to replace them, but you're not going to be penalized until you reach that quota. So I think that's a good evolution of the rules.
Yeah. But I might be old school, and it might be my rewind thinking, my non-forward thinking in that aspect. That look, I'm old school. I was raised and born and raised with the idea that, look, you can change everything. You can make the car better. You can evolve the car. You can change the part. You can have a new piece every single weekend if you want. I was born and raised in the 80s and 90s watching F1. So for me to have teams restricted an amount of weight on fuel, the amount of this and that, you cannot achieve the best out of your car because of all those restrictions, it's still counterintuitive for me to have a car that you cannot push the damn car or change the damn car or have a better piece that you can put in that you have if you just want to. No, you can't. There's so many rules that sometimes it's a little counterintuitive for me that, look, those are supposed to be the fastest damn car on this planet, and because of the restrictions, they're not. So I'm still, that aspect of the sport is still hard to grasp and to wrap my head around for me, but I need and I want those cars to maybe go faster, or maybe there's I know it's a cost cutting and it's to make the sports more fair because it's only a handful of teams that could have all those pieces and do all those evolution, but still that aspect of the sport needs to come back for me to be the fastest and most efficient, the most engineering beauty that we can do as a car.
Well, how about back in the 80s and 90s when they had the spare cars? So when they had a big crash at the beginning, Vettel would be going back to the pits and getting into a spare car and getting ready for a restart or something like that. But that was kind of interesting also, watching Sebastian Vettel racing back to the pits, not on the back of the scooter, but at the front, because we were watching the race and my wife said to me, well, why is Vettel, what's he doing? Why is he wearing somebody else's helmet? And then we realized, he's not on the back. He's actually driving the thing.
He needed to drive. He needed to drive, I think. He needed to get this out of his system and be like, dude, are you ready? Are you strapped in? Because I'm not going to go at 10 kilometers an hour. We're racing back to the pits.
I think he probably was going to take off whether or not that guy was sitting on the behind him or not. But let's talk about now the end of the race. We were talking before we started recording here about the interesting scenes in before the podium celebration and some of the awkward conversations between the president of Russia, Mr. Vladimir Putin, and some of the different drivers, and how it looked a little bit awkward.
It was so awesome. It was one of the most beautiful things. This is one of the things that is, I think it's an idea that is genius. I don't know who had the idea of that driver's area when everybody's really coming out of their car and still the adrenaline and everything. Put them all together in the same room and then just put Vladimir Putin in his translator in there and just record everything and see how it looks like. And you had Vladimir Putin going to Hamilton, Raikkonen, and Nico Rosberg. He spoke the longest to Rosberg, saying, look, how was the track? How was the race? How was the organization? How was the facilities? Was it good? Was it what you wanted? Do you need more? Do you need anything? It's almost like he was saying, look, Nico, you need something? Call me. Uncle Vladdy would take care of it. So it's almost with the feeling that it had of a uncle, a grandfather on Sunday after a family picnic that he organized. He asked everybody, was everything all right? Did everybody like the party? The food was good? The decoration was good? And everybody was okay? Perfect.
It seemed a little bit awkward at times, but it was really cool. And then, of course, a couple of weeks ago, it was actually pretty awesome, the whole thing. it was also really cool the other week when we saw Sebastian Vettel really going at it with Danny Kvyat in China, just really getting in there, and I just loved how the camera was there, and it just kind of like rolled, and it was completely uncensored in there. There wasn't anybody there, kind of maybe just panning over to somebody else or cutting real. Maybe to something outside that's happening on the track. So that is a brilliant bit of television, and it's fast becoming one of my most anticipated and looked forward to parts of the entire race. Is that driver's area, just that 2 to 3 minutes where they just let the cameras roll. And it says, like, what gems are we going to see this week?
It's so real. It's raw. It's real. It's the drivers know there's cameras. They see the cameramans walking around. So they do act politely, but you still have that fire, that adrenaline, that energy and opinions coming out of a driver that just spent an hour and a half going at 300 kilometers an hour. So that comes out in the comments and the conversations. And even if you're looking at Hamilton and Rosberg, it's funny to see their interactions in the same room after a weekend where one is like, it's literally the ecstasy of victory and the agony of defeat all together in the same room, in the same team. And that's why I forgot to mention this. This week, Mercedes took their 2 chief engineers of both team and switched them. So the one that was with Hamilton is with Rosberg. The one that was with Rosberg is with Hamilton, to give both of them basically this. Look, for one of you it was easy. For one of you it was hard. You had all the success. But it doesn't mean that your success cannot help Hamilton. And it doesn't mean that your struggle won't help Rosberg. So both of you switch sides. And I think it's important to see that they're trying to make this as a one team, and the reactions and the comments between those two drivers in that room reflects that too. They're more polite with each other than they were last year, probably.
Yeah, I think at times last year and the year before, it was definitely I think frosty is probably a way of frosty, yeah. Maybe is sugarcoating it to a certain degree, but Mercedes was also out in the news in the last day or so, making some apologies or maybe clarifying their stance on social media that they're not overly favoring Nico Rosberg compared to like Lewis Hamilton, which I thought was a bit of an interesting thing to say, but maybe it's just one of those situations where they've had more positive things to talk about for Nico Rosberg, that he's had all these wins, he's been so dominant, and some of the things that have befallen Lewis Hamilton maybe aren't things that they really want to promote with their brand and their public image. We don't want people to know that Mercedes engines are unreliable, and like some of the problems that Hamilton had, and starting at the back of the grid in China, even though he had a very good finish to get as far up the grid as he did. But
I have a question for you, Mark. You just brought something up, and I think it's important we talk about it. Do you think there's a correlation? Because between you and me, there's none. It's even if like Nico Rosberg's engine or Hamilton's engine blew up, the car that you're going to buy at the dealership of Mercedes, there's nothing to do with that. But in people's perception and optics, or maybe just in people's demented, twisted ideas up in the echelon of Mercedes, think that, look, what our F1 car looks like, people are going to think that all our cars look like. Do you think that exists still, or do you think people have moved on and know that there's no correlation whatsoever between what happens in the F1 team and the type of car that you buy?
Well, what was that famous saying for years? Was that win on Sunday, sell on Monday. Or something like that? So I think that it's not so much favoring Rosberg over Hamilton. I think it's just part of a larger marketing and brand image. I mean, I have many friends that work in the marketing world, so I'm not a professional in that profession by any means, but it sounds very similar to what I hear people talking about. That's definitely, it just seems like an image thing. It just seems like a brand thing. It's just like, let's just put out the good news. And I'm sure that if they had like a a completely flawless performance, that neither of them had these niggling little mechanical issues in the latter part of the race, and they both were dominant, and they basically crossed the finish line side by side, and they'd gone at it dicing for the lead for the entire race. That would be all over the place. But I think they're just being selective in what they're putting out there to the market on social media.
Makes sense.
It does. All right. Well, I think that's pretty much all we've got for this week. We've got Spain coming up in about 10 days, which is kind of cool for me. That was the last Grand Prix I was able to make it to in 2014. Being stationed out here on the west coast of Canada isn't very convenient to getting to very many Grand Prix, but that will always be a good one, and one for many memories. And that was also a very dominant performance by Lewis Hamilton in 2014. So anyways, before we go, Kevin, just remind everybody where they can find you online.
You can find myself on Twitter at Kev Laramie, and find all the radio shows and podcasts that we do on SPN on sportspodcastingnetwork.com.
Thank you very much. And of course, you can find me on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod. And if you want to email me anything for the show, if you have any questions or comments, you can email me at scuderiaf1pod@gmail.com. Anyways, that's a wrap. We will catch you guys again in about 10 days after the Spanish Grand Prix. And until then, we'll catch you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Scuderia F1 podcast. If you want to get the show notes for this episode, then head over to ScuderiaF1pod.com. Want to get in touch with us? Then email us at ScuderiaF1pod@gmail.com.